and welcome to the video. My name is Cam Ward and today we're going to be reviewing the Blackmagic Ursa 12K. Now this is going to be a very casual review of the camera as a whole. I don't actually have it with me because I'm living in the Netherlands right now and I keep a lot of my camera equipment in the UK because that's where most of my work is. I'm a director, DOP, editor. I do a little bit of everything from high-end commercial work to music videos. I do a lot of work, all that kind of stuff with very different cameras across the board. Blackmagic did provide me with the Ursa 12K camera. They didn't ask me for any review or anything like that about the camera. They just said, give this camera a go, see what you think of it, and let's chat afterwards, basically. If you want to know my thoughts and feelings on the 6K Pro, which they also provided to me, because before that I was just using the Pocket 4K, which I did buy myself and did a review on, but they were very keen to get me using some of the bigger cameras just so that I could kind of understand them as a product and just hear my thoughts and feelings on them, which has been awesome because it's been great to kind of have that dialogue with Blackmagic as a camera company directly. So after using the Ursa 12K for a good few months now, I've got to say it's a very, very underrated and underappreciated camera in the cinema kind of camera market. That being said, it does have some quirks that I do understand why more people haven't kind of picked these up and jumped on them. So in this video, I'm going to talk about the camera as a whole, not scientific, nothing like that, just kind of my thoughts and feelings on it after using it in practical real world environments, as well as how it stacks up in the actual space against competition such as Red. And to be honest, I've not done too much work with the Ursa 12K, but I have done a spec narrative shoot, some random test footage with Esther, and some kind of, it's like a little bit of a music video. So I'll kind of be drip feeding some of that footage in throughout this video, just so you're not looking at my face for the entirety of this whole thing. And the lenses used with the camera throughout these tests were primarily the DZO Film Vespid lenses, as well as the Lensbaby Twist and the Sigma 18-35, a classic, and the Canon 2470. So when I spoke to Blackmagic initially and they said about sending me one of these cameras out to test, I actually said to them, can you give me it in the smallest, lightest possible configuration possible, please? Because I generally love shooting with compact packages, and that's something I loved about the Scarlett W when I owned that. Now the Red accessories were very expensive to go with that, but as a nice little package, I love that camera because everything was kind of bolted together and it felt very sturdy and secure. So if you're purely here for how I find this camera to stack up against things like the Komodo and the Komodo X, I would say that I believe the closest camera to the Ursa 12K competition-wise is actually the Red V-Raptor, which might seem crazy because of the price difference, but we'll get into that later on as well. So something which I think is incredibly important on YouTube is kind of understand who you're listening to and who you're watching. In my opinion, there's a lot of smoke and mirrors that goes on YouTube. There's a lot of people out there that say they're doing high-end commercials or music video at a higher level than they actually are. When they say they're doing a high-end commercial, it's actually just them with a camera at a car dealership, for example. But in reality, that's not a commercial. I mean, that's a different thing altogether. But when I talk about commercials, I mean high-end commercial work, you know, big budgets done in the traditional system. So does that really matter when it comes down to a camera review? I'm gonna say yes, because when you start to talk about tools at a certain level, it actually does matter which brand you're using to some extent. And when it comes to what brand you're using and if it's gonna affect kind of your career, it does make a difference when kind of making that purchasing decision. And I mentioned that because it kind of brings me back to the Ursa 12K and why I hadn't bought one before Blackmagic kind of provided me one. When you're in the higher level and you're in the kind of world of commercials and music videos, DOPs and agencies will generally just go for ARRI. If they're not using ARRI, then they're gonna go to Red. And if they're not going there and it's a documentary shoot, for example, they're probably gonna go for Sony. So that being said, I believe this is why Blackmagic kind of provided me this camera, because it seems to me that they're really pushing to get more into this kind of commercial space and they want to get these cameras more onto sets. So in my opinion, Blackmagic cameras are perfect entry-level cameras, and they're also incredible for professional use, which is what makes the brand so interesting to me. So the way I've kind of wanted to lay this video out is more about looking at the landscape as a whole, because this camera's been out for a while now, so it's important to look at how it stacks up in the entire industry and why you might want to choose one versus other cameras. So I'm going to get more into the nitty-gritty about what the Ursa 12K Pro is, my likes and dislikes, a little bit later in the video. So first we're going to talk about how it compares and stacks up to the competition. So for me personally, this camera is directly competing with the likes of the Red Raptor and the Komodo X. The only real reason you should be choosing those cameras over this one is for the following reasons. Preference for color science, branding, whether you like it or not. As I mentioned earlier, it does matter which camera you're using when you kind of go to those higher levels from what I've experienced. People are still a little skeptical to be using Blackmagic professionally on set as the sole camera, but hopefully that will change given kind of their push on kind of providing the camera to people like me and other directors and DOPs out there as well, trying to get these things onto more commercial high-end sets so that people can understand the products more, use them more, and feel more comfortable using them. So another point is ergonomics. The form factor of Red cameras is awesome in my opinion. I love the modularity of them and building them out. Also comes with some downsides as well, having that Red ecosystem like that. Again, I'll talk about that later. But I have told Blackmagic this, that I do love that Komodo form factor, and they've probably seen many of the posts that people have been saying they want that box camera. I was in that boat as well, where I'm like, I love the Komodo, the accessories, building it up and stuff like that. And then they pointed out immediately, they were like, you know, the Ursa 12K has everything built in. You're pretty much good to go straight away without paying anything extra. So that actually, after using the Ursa 12K, I'm like, oh, you know, they've got a good point. So yeah, but more on that later on. So in terms of performance, the camera I'm going to stack this up against is actually the Red Raptor, and does the Ursa 12K beat because of the full frame capabilities of that camera. Its frame rate performance for me is on par. The Raptor does go up to 600 frames per second, which is awesome, but the sensor crops on Red, in my opinion, can get very messy. Now I've heard it's not as bad on the V Raptor, but it's still something to bear in mind because the Ursa 12K will get you up to 240 frames per second in 4K and 120 FPS in Super 35. From my experience, this is more than enough. If you add software into the mix as well, you could slow that footage down even further. I don't think it's really needed, and if you do need to go that far, chances are you're gonna need a lot of lighting, and then you should really have the budget to go and get a Phantom camera. And obviously the biggest differential between those two cameras, the Red Raptor and the Ursa 12K, is of course the cost. And that is where the Ursa absolutely destroys both the Komodo X and the Raptor. And as I mentioned, everything you need is built into this camera. Now you might be wondering why I haven't mentioned kind of more popular cameras such as the Sony FX line and Canon. It's because they have autofocus, and for me, they are more documentary focused. When I've shot documentary work or reality TV, we've opted for Sony cameras because they're easier to use on the fly, run and gun, you've got the autofocus there. And yeah, you know, more people are using these cameras for commercial and narrative use as well. But in my world, these are, you know, Arri and Red are the ones that I generally try and steer towards. So I'm gonna say a little bit about kind of branding here as well. Red is awesome from a brand perspective. I think they've really nailed it in terms of having their branding and their marketing right in terms of releasing a new product and the shiny new thing, and we all get a little bit tempted by it. And back in the day, it was like a little bit of an achievement to own a Red camera. And for me, after owning a Scarlett W in the past, and my current work primarily as a director, I just don't want or need to be spending that amount of money on a camera right now. On to another completely subjective topic, the look of these cameras. We all generally love the Alexa look, and it's kind of the thing that we're used to, and I think that's what many of us have kind of been conditioned to as kind of cinematic. I love it, but I don't need to own an Alexa. I found the Blackmagic Color Science to get me most of the way there in terms of almost matching that, and that's one of the key reasons why I love these cameras. And Personally, I don't look at cameras from a scientific point of view. There are other channels like, say, Gerald Undone that covers that perfectly, but for me, I don't enjoy those videos and can really appreciate someone using the product in the field to understand its quirks, the reliability of it, etc. And I think Philip Bloom's a great example of that. So just again, something to keep in mind when watching videos from different YouTubers or different online people about reviews of these cameras. Do you enjoy their work? Do you enjoy the look of it? And if so, go for it, because that's the most important thing at the end of the day, rather than the technical specifications all the time. Do you like the physical kind of subconscious feel almost that this camera and the image provides for you? So, all that out of the way, let's actually talk about the camera itself. The Ursa 12K, in a word, is awesome. And I've used that word a lot already in this video, but I'd actually say a bit of diamond in the rough. And it's a damn shame the camera fell flat on its face like when it launched because of 12K. It was definitely ahead of its time, and they probably should have gone with 8K, which even still probably would have been a little bit ahead of its time. In short, I'd say solid software in the camera. It's very easy to use, very intuitive. It's got amazing features with the frame rates, but it's got clunky ergonomics. So let's break it down a little bit. We'll start with the pros. It's got an absolutely beautiful image. I would say this is one of my favorite images. I think Ari's got it beat just a little bit, but you know, a lot of that can be matched in post. The EF and PL mount is interchangeable, and it's also included in the box, which for me is a massive plus, because you know, some companies will charge you a lot of money to have that option or make you stick with one mount and that's it. And I think it's awesome that this is in the box. It allows me to swap to EF mount for the lenses that I already own for smaller projects where it's just me working with the camera, or swap it to the PL mount for bigger productions when we want to use cinema lenses, or even just we've got the Ursa 12K B cam and we want to match it with our A cam, the Alexa or something, and we can have the same lenses across the board, which is awesome. So as I mentioned before, everything is built in. So you could rig it up, but it's perfectly usable as it is. This is how I love to shoot with the camera. Just put a little battery, a slim V mount on the back, top handle, and yeah, and then you could just run around with it as it is. It's super light, super portable. You've got a little screen which flips out. Just really cool little camera to run with that much power inside of it. You could also, I've seen videos of this, mount it onto the DJI Ronin 2. So, you know, a little prosumer gimbal, you could put it on there with a super lightweight lens and you're good to go. And I've got to, of course, mention the frame rate options. Going up to 60 frames per second in 12K, 120 frames per second in 8K, and 240 frames per second in Super 16. I use this shooting a narrative kind of spec project in 8K, 160 frames per second in widescreen, and it just looked fantastic. I was so impressed with its ability to do that. It's just awesome. It's so cool to have that feature inside a camera, which of course, the biggest pro of all is the price. I think, I believe it's about $6,000 or £6,000 in the UK. You've got everything in there. The only other thing you need to buy with that is some media and some batteries. So what, you're looking at maybe £6,500 for a camera, which in my opinion rivals the Red Raptor, which is just mind-blowing. It's absolutely insane that this camera has been overlooked because it's so impressive for anyone. If you're a solo shooter to someone who's shooting kind of bigger projects, just very, very impressive stuff. And I really appreciate Blackmagic doing that and kind of going at that price point, especially now. I mean, it did launch at a higher price, but now they've cut that price down. I think it's fantastic. Really, really great. Not so sure if I would pick one up over these other cameras for the reasons mentioned, in my personal kind of opinion and position right now, but I certainly think they're onto something great for a potential next camera. So I've got a section here about kind of so-so, and these are things which are like, yeah, they're good, but they could be better maybe. So I'll talk about that before getting into the kind of the cons of this camera. So first up is the built-in screen. Beautiful, nice to use software, very easy and intuitive. It generally works well. In the rain, which is when we shot this spec, it was borderline useless. Like there was rain getting on the screen, and you know, obviously a lot of monitors and screens will do that. That's just the way it goes. But I did switch to using the viewfinder attachment, which did have its own set of issues as well. I'm not sure if it's the batteries we were using just didn't have the power to kind of run with it, but sometimes I would look into it and then I'd move away from it and it would auto dim, which is it's fine. When I came to it, it just had no idea I was there. And then it would just spark into life. But I'm not a big fan of using viewfinders. I do prefer to use a monitor. So that was just me. That was my experience with that. The bezels are far too big as well on the screen. It feels very old-fashioned. And it doesn't flip 360 degrees, which obviously this isn't for vlogging, but there are use case scenarios where I'd find that useful. For example, on this shoot, the actress wanted to see if she was in position. She wanted to check something. To be able to flip that screen around would have been awesome. Obviously, a lot of people do use bigger screens, small HD monitors, other stuff which is rigged up on the camera, but as I said, I like to have a small run and gun form factor when I'm operating a camera like this. So the battery life is just okay, it's fine. The V-mount does offer, a great variety of power options, so that's a great mount to have on the back of it. I have no complaints with it. I had a good few batteries on the go. I find it perfectly fine. I'm not sure if this is included. I'm sure it probably is, but you can just plug this thing straight into a wall as well and just power it from the mains, which we did in the music video. So that kind of relieves any battery anxiety for the entire day. So let's get on to form factor. It's a pretty big camera, but it does have everything you need built in, as mentioned. Even slimmed down, which is really it's a massive win over the Red cameras. But having modularity would be great on a separate kind of platform. For a different camera, having modularity would be awesome. But let's say you're on a slightly tighter budget and you need everything all in one. The Ursa 12K ticks that box. It does get pretty heavy. It's a cinema camera. It's not the lightest camera in the world. It's not the heaviest camera I've used. The kind of camera I was thinking like, would I take this on a hike? Would I take it on a road trip? Even though it is small and compact. Probably not. I'd take the 6K Pro because you're getting most of the way there in terms of image quality and performance from the smaller camera. So that's the camera I'd probably choose if you're just kind of a running gunner. If you're more of a videographer, I'd go for the 6K Pro over the Ursa 12K. But if you want to make that next step up and you're doing a lot of narrative work as well, then the Ursa 12K Pro would be a fantastic option. So I've got 12K down as a resolution on the so-so list, and you would think more would be better. And if you don't like it, don't use it. I believe Blackmagic are aware that 12K was too far. Even in my testing, I just didn't shoot 12K. What they told me was very interesting. And I said to them initially when they gave me this camera, I said, I don't shoot 12K and I don't need 12K. So this camera is not really for me. And they said, well, this camera is a superb 8K camera. That's the sweet spot for this camera. And I completely agree with that. So if they had launched this as an 8K camera, perhaps oversampled from 12K, I think this thing really would have taken off when it launched. So in terms of the frame rates as well, there's no crop. You can go 160 frames per second in 8K, and you can go 4K 160 frames per second, and there's no crop, which is bloody awesome. If you do want to go to 240 frames per second, there is a crop at Super 16. In terms of another thing, which is kind of like a bit odd for me anyway, I was like, okay, I'm shooting on the 6K and I'm shooting on the Ursa 12K at the same time. Let me just shoot 6K for this whole project and I'll go in the Ursa for that. All of a sudden there's a Super 16 crop. And I wasn't really sure why that was the case. I mean, I'm sure there's a technical reason that I don't understand for that, but I just thought it was a bit odd that I couldn't just shoot 6K and use the full Super 35 sensor for that. So we ended up just shooting 8K because we might as well not have the crop and have the extra resolution. Now, the thing that I find quite interesting about modularity in the form factor of the Ursa 12K is that they could easily go for modularity because they already sell a lot of the extras you need to have a modular camera, like separately. So you've got the hand grip, you've got the top handle, you've got the monitors that Blackmagic offer. So you could quite easily sell a smaller form factor camera for a good price point and then tag the extras on if you want to have a complete circle in terms of ecosystem there with your kind of accessories, which is very interesting compared to other companies because I'm not sure I can think of another brand which has those options. You buy a Komodo, for example, you could have red side handle, but you might have a different brand of monitor. I know they have their own monitor, but generally people are kind of going for a cheaper option there. So it's quite interesting that you could have Blackmagic all the way around, you know? So yeah, just a thought I had anyway. The EF and PL mount, I've said it's great that they have the option to switch, include it in the box. But again, as I've said so many times about these videos, I feel like the RF mount would give us more flexibility across the board, which would let us choose if we want Super 35 or use adapters such as Metabone speed boosters to get us to full frame and that would give these cameras a massive advantage in the market. There are rumors going around about the L mount being in use, but to be honest, I don't think I've ever used the L mount, so I don't really know enough about it to give a good kind of opinion on that. Kind of another con about this camera, there's no real low light performance, and I noticed a fair amount of noise from 1600 ISO onwards, so I wouldn't really recommend it for a low light camera. None of the cameras are actually very good in low light, and if you've got the budget to be using a cinema camera, generally you should have the budget to have the lighting to go along with that, so you shouldn't really find yourself in kind of a low light situation unless that's something you are going for look-wise. Did have a few weird issues with the camera. Some cross-hatching going on in Premiere Pro, a bit bizarre. I'm not sure where that was coming from, but it did resolve itself. There's tons of chroma noise in some of the footage. It wasn't for every shot, and it could have been that the sensor perhaps needed to warm up because there is no black shading process as you get with Red cameras or other cameras. So I'm not sure if that was something. I appreciate that there's no black shading process necessarily or camera calibration that needs to go on, because you can just fire this thing up and just get going, which you can't with a lot of the competition. The function buttons, they're weirdly placed, and I think a very simple thing which could fix this is having textured buttons. So for example, where the flip out screen is, just in front of that is the 3 little function buttons that you can set for anything you want. But when you're shooting and you're out and about and you're kind of in that moment, your fingers are trying to find these buttons sometimes. I'm sure after years of use, you'd figure this thing out of where they all are. But for me, I was like, oh, is the front one? Am I pressing the front, the back one? I don't know. It's windy, there's rain coming in. I'm pressing them all to try and figure it out. I just thought it was a bit odd. And same goes for the record button as well. It's just not in an ergonomic place. It's like on the inside of the monitor and you're like trying to get in there. It's just a bit odd to me why there isn't one just on the front right-hand side where your hand might be, or on the left, just a bit odd. You can also tap the screen as well, which is literally something I think I figured out on the day because it just never occurred to me to press the button to start the record. So yeah, that was that. There was an odd little quirk, which I did find, and I found this on a lot of the cameras actually, and it might be me being quite stupid here. If you know the solution to this, just let me know in the comments, please. But the back button doesn't actually take you out of playback. So if you go check a clip, the back button just wouldn't do anything. So I had to hit the record button to get out of it, which can sometimes trigger a take, which seems really odd, like a weird oversight for such good software. There was one other thing as well, which was really weird motion blur on the screen, on the flip out monitor. And it kind of resolved itself naturally. I'm not sure what happened, turning it off and on a few times just seemed to kind of get it to work. But yeah, it could have just been a software thing, and it only happened one time, but it was just a bit odd in that moment when kind of you're ready to roll and all of a sudden you're like, the motion blur is completely off. And I'm not sure why, my settings are all dialed in. So yeah, a little bit weird. I think an interesting marketing tactic for Blackmagic as a kind of like just a video to do for their next camera would be to kind of battle test it and show a video of this thing being thrown around, kind of being used in extreme environments, not the Ursa 12K Pro, but just whatever their next camera is, for example, if they want to really get into the cinema camera route. Because I think people have, especially DOPs, I think they've kind of got a look on it where it's like, okay, this is a great camera, but it's for entry level, or it's not really used on professional stuff. Can I rely on this camera? Is it almost safe to use on a professional set? So I think a video like that and some marketing around kind of more battle testing would be really beneficial for Blackmagic. So in conclusion, if Blackmagic can switch to full frame or a mount which can support adapters to get it to full frame, I think they're onto a winner here. I'm not sure if this is the camera to do that with in terms of the body and the design, or if they need to do a full redesign of the camera, because to be honest, it seemed kind of dead on arrival with the 12K resolution, and even now it's very overlooked and there's not too many people talking about this camera anymore. But I think with a smart redesign along with more thought out economics, better low light, and a marketing which kind of focuses on being battle tested, reliable for professionals in any kind of climate or ecosystem, I think that Blackmagic could truly have a camera which can compete in the cinema space along with some of these other big hitters. Autofocus would definitely just take it to another level in terms of accessibility and again compete with some of these other cameras such as Canon and Sony, but for me it's not something I ever use, something I'm, to be honest, really that interested in. So is this the camera for you? To be honest, that's for you to decide. Now, I do think a lot of people will be fine with the Pocket 6K Pro over this camera, But if you aren't in the traditional system, and I know a lot of people like to bounce between the two like I do, where you're kind of going for the high-end stuff versus the music video stuff where you've got no budget and you're kind of doing a lot of the things yourself, the operating, the shooting, then that's where this is a camera which kind of fits perfectly into that space, which is just awesome. But it gets a little bit tricky when people start asking you what kit you're using for the shoot, and you'll know if you're encountering this because, you know, it's mentioned by the client. There's been a lot of times where I speak to the agencies and they say, okay, we've got this little job, but there's not as much budget. It's just kind of a content focused job, for example. You know, you'll have a first AC and whatnot. And I'll be like, oh, I'll just use the Ursa 12K, yeah, because I've got it. And they'll be like, we shot Sony on the previous thing and the client likes Sony, so we want to go with that on this one. And that's a real thing that happens, and you'll know if that happens. But if no one cares what you're shooting on, if there isn't anyone asking for that, or kind of, if there's no outside influence on what tools you use for the job, then go for the Ursa 12K. It's gonna cover your bases, and Pocket 4K is also cheap enough to be a B cam, and that one will offer you full frame with the right adapters, and it'll match nicely on a budget. So yeah, I think the family of cameras that Blackmagic have right now is awesome, and there's something for everyone in there. You know, if you love Blackmagic and you're on the 6K right now and you want that upgrade to a cinema camera, the 12K is kind of, I would say it's perfect as an upgrade, but you've really got to ask yourself, you know, what features do I not have right now that I'll truly be using on the Ursa 12K? And if I end up in a situation where I need to be slightly higher ISO, am I going to be okay with that? You know, for me, it's about a camera which can kind of cover your bases, and there isn't a perfect tool for everything. So the beauty of Blackmagic is that a lot of their tools, if you have a couple of them, will cover you in most situations. So will I be using this camera more? On self-shooting projects or projects where I'm the DOP, then yes. You know, I have it now, so I will definitely be making the most of using it. That being said, I will still be opting for my DOP's recommendation on each specific job when I'm in the role of director, and they'll generally still likely remain at Arri, Red, or Sony at this current time. Generally on the projects I have been pushing more for Blackmagic because I love the cameras. I want to get these things kind of out there and use more because I think they're just awesome tools. If there's kind of one thing to take away from this video, is that I think the Ursa 12K is an incredible camera, an incredible price point. Crazy to see how overlooked it became. So thank you very much for watching. My name is Cam Ward. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to hit like and subscribe. Any questions about the cameras, or do you want to check cameras in general, drop me a comment or hit me up on Instagram at Cam Ward Film. Possibly going to do a video on the DZO Film Vespid lenses, as mentioned, that I used in this video. But yeah, that's me. And thank you so much for watching. I do really appreciate it. And yeah, I'll catch you in the next one.